All right. Hey, good morning. It's a brand new week, and we'll see what unfolds in that. I hope you guys had a great weekend. We piddled around with HK and Allie and Jared and Courtney. They came over. Rachel had a brunch for all the women. She's getting ready to get married, right, to my sons. So anyway, they had a big brunch, and it was a good weekend. Just hung out, my son and I, and HK wandered around in Trustful and just had really a great time yesterday. Man, was good. I love the share. I know you probably get tired of me saying that, but our share time, which most churches don't have an opportunity to do because they don't set themselves up for that, is just absolutely amazing. And man, it was just good, really good. So, hey, that's where we've been. Hope yours is good as well. We'll be heading out Thursday afternoon to head to Peachtree City, so Jared and Courtney can head out to California for a weekend break with Allie and HK. So we'll be heading out. We'll be heading out over there and hanging out with the girls, and looking forward to that. So that's what's going on in our world, and we'll. I got basketball tonight, so we'll see what's happening. We stay fairly busy. So, listen, we are over the weekend. As I began to kind of sift through some things, I thought, well, maybe I'll do Second and Third John, and since we've done First John, new book, and looking forward to it. And then I thought, I think I want to go ahead and tackle the Gospel of John. So, what we're going to do is the Gospel of John, that's Lord willing. The Gospel of John, a recap of First John, because I taught that early on. It was the second book I taught as we began these daily doses. So that was back in 2020. And then we're going to do Second, Third John. And I think we're just going to jump right on into the Revelation. So we're going to knock out all of John. May take us 20 years to do it, but that's where we're going. And so we'll see what happens. So I want to give us an introduction into the man, John. And just kind of do that today. Probably won't be a very long lesson today. More important to just really define who he was. So traditional history says that John the Apostle wrote the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, in the book of the Revelation. You get other people that come along and kind of discount that down through the years and say, well, there's really no way that he could have done that. He wasn't articulate enough. He was a fisherman, and there's no valid proof of that. It's just for whatever reason people want to have different opinions. But traditionally, history says John the Apostle, the disciple whom Jesus loved, wrote it. Now there is a reference to John the Elder, but if you study through the early fathers, that's how they referred to John the Apostle, because he was old, so he was John the Elder. He was like the last of last man standing, so to speak. And so John, and we're going to go ahead and state it like this: John wrote all four of those. Now, it was classic that the writers of the Gospels did not mention themselves by name. So you won't find their name in those Gospels. But history tells us that that's who they were. So some of these were written later in life. Some of these were written like Mark is really Peter's account of the Gospel account, but John Mark is the one who wrote it. Peter kind of digested all of that to John Mark, and then Mark wrote, right? So this is what happened to a lot of them. And so however you want to term it, there's really little doubt, according to the church history, that John wrote these 5 books. So with that said, let's just look at who John is. So John was quite possibly one of the first to begin to follow Jesus. He was a disciple of John the Baptist. And so when in that phrase, when he says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world," when John the Baptist says that John was one of those who began to separate from John the Baptist and follow after Jesus himself. And so John was one of the younger disciples, and he was born somewhere in AD 6 AD. So that, and he lived somewhere to 100 AD. He lived 93 to 94 years. That's kind of where his range was. He was obviously the oldest senior apostle that lived the longest, who died without martyrdom, dying of martyrdom. And so that's where we find him. He is the son of Zebedee, and his mother is Salome. And we can piece together a few things, and it seems as though John's mother and Jesus' mother were sisters. And so that makes John somewhat of a cousin as well. John the Baptist was also. So there was this close familial relationship that was taking place, that's going on. And so that's what's going on. We understand that they were fairly well off. Zebedee's fishing empire was big enough to need partners. His partners were Peter and Andrew and their dad. And so you had these Zebedee and his sons and Peter's dad and his sons. And so they're in this fishing enterprise. And so James and John, excuse me, I got a cold. James and John, Peter and Andrew were fishing partners. So they all ended up in the ministry as apostles, following after Jesus. His brother was James. They were known as the Sons of Thunder. So back in those days, there were political parties, much like there are today. And James and John were a part of the, you want to call them the extremists or whatever. They were all for rioting against Rome, for upsetting the apple cart, for coming out from underneath that, to bring Israel out from underneath that thumbprint of Rome. And so they were known as Sons of Thunder. They're the ones who said, "Hey, Lord, do you want us to call down fire on them?" Right? I mean, so this is who they were. They wanted prominence in this kingdom. Listen, they saw themselves as frontline soldiers in the war against Rome and Rome's subversion of Israel. And so they are the ones, you remember, who got their mother to come and talk to Jesus, which would have been his aunt, and said, "Hey, when you come into your kingdom, can my sons have one son, a seat on the right and on the left?" Right? And Jesus looked at her and goes, "Woman, you don't even know what you're asking." And so this is kind of who he is and what's going on. He wrote the Gospel of John. And he refers to himself at the very end of it as the disciple whom Jesus loved. The date of that writing of this book is somewhere, originally it was like 140 AD. We found some papers later on, the Ryland Papyrus, that there was a few verses of John which says, okay, well then that wasn't it. It was somewhere between 85 and 90 AD. There are some who think it was even earlier than that. So we'll, just leave it at that. It was somewhere around the end of the first century that John wrote this gospel. He wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John after that. 90 AD is when he wrote those. He's pastoring in Ephesus at this point. And so he's kind of overseeing the churches in Asia Minor, which is the 7 churches that are mentioned in his revelation that was given to him when Jesus says, "Write these things to the 7 churches." And so John's the granddaddy, right? He's the old man over all of that. And so he wrote that from Ephesus around 90 AD. At some point in all of that, persecution took place. Domitian, one of the Caesars, began to rise into power. By this time, 70 AD, Jerusalem has been ransacked. Nero's burned Rome. Nero's on the downslide. Domitian is now Caesar, and he's brutal, absolutely brutal. Lots of persecution. Terrible things are going on. John got caught up in that. The other apostles, for the most part, had all lost their lives under Nero's reign or in various aspects around the world. Thomas being in India, which wasn't under Rome's domain at that time. Lost his life about halfway through his evangelistic travels through India. So we have John then, who tradition says, the scripture doesn't, but tradition says that they boiled him in oil. He survived that. So what do you do with a guy that you can't boil in oil and kill? You banish him to an island, and so he was banished to the Isle of Patmos. He spent the rest of his days there. Some say he might have been freed near the end. But history's a little fuzzy on some of those pieces. And so what we find is that John wrote the book of the Revelation. It's not Revelations. There's one revelation. John the Revelator wrote one because God gave him one revelation. And so that's what he wrote down. So just for record, it's just a little pet peeve of mine. When somebody says, let's look at Revelations. It's like there's not a lot of revelations. There's one, right? The book of the Revelation. So anyway, that's what he's done. He was one of the close circle of Jesus. Peter, James, and John. It was always Peter, James, and John, right? That was his first triumvirate, they call it. Those were his close associates. It was James and John. Peter and John, who went and secured the donkey for him to ride in on. It was Peter and John who ran to the tomb when Mary said, "Hey, Jesus is not there." And so you see that going on. It was at the end of the. It was at the end of Jesus' life as he has been resurrected, and he meets them on the beach. It's Peter and John that he takes Peter out on a walk, and John is kind of hovering over there on the side. And there's that conversation where Peter says, "Well, Lord, but what about him?" Because this is when Jesus, the incredible encounter where Jesus looks at Peter and says, "Peter, do you love me?" Right? He does it 3 times. 3 times he denied him. 3 times he asked, "Do you love me?" He says, "Listen, I want you to feed my sheep." And so there must have been a little rivalry between them, because then Peter looks at Jesus and goes, "Well, what about him, John, the disciple whom Jesus loved?" He said, "What if I want him to live until I come back? What's that to you?" Right? And so there was this then saying that went around that that John was going to live forever. Obviously he didn't, but those were kind of the things and the ramblings that were going on. John was one of the few disciples, or apostles rather, that witnessed the crucifixion. In fact, he's the only one we know of. I'm not saying the others weren't, but we do know they all scattered in the garden. But John was standing there next to Mary, the mother of Jesus, and a couple of other ladies when he was being crucified. Because from the cross, Jesus looks at Mary, his mother, and says, "Mary, behold your son," pointing to John. And then to John, he says, "John, behold your mother." What he's saying is, hey, I need you to take care of mom in this life. And so there was that took place. So this is who John is. And I've been kind of deep diving into the ancient church fathers. A lot of our church history, we tend to look at somewhere around the 1500s, but there was a lot of history that happened well before that. And I'm of the opinion that the closer you get to the original, the more truthful and impactful some of those things are. And so, I like to go as far back as you can in those things. And so John had some proteges, Polycarp, who was powerful. He's written several books, and you can read those. They're incredible truth. He was called the Bishop of Smyrna, so that means he pastored the churches in Smyrna, which is one of the letters in the 7 letters of the book of the Revelation. Polycarp taught Irenaeus, who was a prominent leader in church history, and so you'll see his name pop up a lot. Ignatius of Antioch wrote great defenses against Gnosticism and so forth. He was a student of John as well, and so he was of Antioch. And so this is kind of where we are, what we're doing. The book of John breaks down. I can't wait to begin to walk with you in that, as I have kind of broken it out, and I'm not going to give you all the details today, because you can look at it, but it breaks out into several categories. One, there's just the introduction, chapter 1, chapter 2 through 10 is he performs a lot of miracles, and every miracle has some controversies with it. And so we'll see those laid out. And then there's the raising of Lazarus, which is the big deal. That's what sent him to the cross as far as the Israel leaders were concerned. And then chapter 13 through 17, it's kind of the last night. Those chapters cover the crucifixion and all of that. Chapter 18 and 20, Jesus' death and resurrection. And then chapter 21 is kind of a closing statement about Jesus. And so it will flow fast. It's different than like when we went through the book of Romans. There's a kind of a verse-by-verse expository looking at words because it's didactic. We call that. It is teaching, and so it's a different way of studying. This is more narrative, and so the flow should be a little faster. We're not dissecting so much of a theological treatise, although there is some of that. We're just looking at, okay, so here's the miracle. What was the result of that, right? So we'll be looking at those. It's kind of neat the way it breaks out. John says he writes this, and this is his reason for writing. John chapter 20, verse 31. He says that I write these that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So he's really clear about why he wrote the gospel, right? So his is more of a factual. He's not writing memoirs. He's simply showing you and me what Jesus was about and how he fulfilled the Old Testament aspects as we look at some of the miracles all and some of the other things all surrounded all the issues like the tabernacle and other things, and so celebrations, and so you'll see that. And so, but this is his point, that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. So he's writing this about 60 years after Jesus had gone, and he's saying, I want to tell you the story of Jesus, so it's down on paper so that the world may know. And I'm trying to convince you that Jesus is the Messiah, and if you believe in that, then you have life in his name. So it's a powerful book. Can't wait to share that with you. He does a similar thing in 1 John when he says, I write these things to you, my brother, that so that you would know that you have eternal life. So that's a different book, and we'll recap that when we're done with this one. I'm not going to keep any longer, otherwise I'm just going to start rambling. I could talk a long time about all of this. I'm in love with the scriptures and just the stories behind. But that's enough for today. Man, Lord bless you guys. Can't wait to jump into the prologue, they call it, of the Gospel of John. And so we'll look at that in the morning. Until then, man, you guys have a great day.